I now call the Snoqualmie City Council Budget Workshop to order. City Clerk, can we please have the roll call?
Councilmember Jeans.
Here.
Councilmember Ross.
Here.
Councilmember Holloway.
Here.
Councilmember Mayhew has not made it yet. Councilmember Munden is not yet arrived. Councilmember Sundwall.
Here.
Councilmember Pruitt.
Here.
Mayor Larson.
I am here. While we do anticipate Councilmembers Munden and Mayhew showing up shortly, I'll need a motion to excuse at this time.
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to excuse Councilmembers Munden and Mayhew. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Motion's carried. With that, I'll turn it over to Rob and Drew to go ahead and kick off the budget discussion.
Well, here we go again. Riveting discussion. So what do we have to do tonight? We're having the discussion of the major budget changes. We have an ordinance that we're second reading of the property tax increase and general property tax tonight, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, yeah. We have to pass the property taxes tonight. We have to pass them to certify with the auditor or the assessor, excuse me, before the end of November. We changed this up a little bit, and it kind of harkens back to when I was here and made similar presentations to which you did not loudly object. And that was to go through the major changes in each of the fund departments. Rather than have a slide for every single one, what we've done is we've grouped the funds by major category: general fund, special revenue, utilities. And I thought we'd discuss the major amendments that we're proposing to you to approve. So we're not going to get into the little niggly stuff.
As long as the numbers add, I'm happy.
Well, I think they will.
Okay.
So is that all right with you? We're going to just go through, start with the general fund, go through the special revenue funds, and just show the major changes.
Good.
And see if you have any questions. Okay. So let's start with the general fund. Incidentally, so the other thing that you may not like is I've excused from this any of the funds or departments for which we had no changes. So they will remain as adopted in 2017 for the 2018 budget. And then we can talk about them, but I've omitted the funds that you cannot change. So we have a couple of bond reserves that are required by the covenants in our bond issues, and we have to maintain those. Can't change them. At the end of the bond, when the bond issues series out, then we can use that money to pay off the last of the serial notes. So those are not on here either. You can't do anything about them anyway. Just verify that in fact they're still legally constituted and they're on the books. So let's start with the city council. The 02 lineup. These are all in the general fund. So the only change is that you guys approved the purchase of streaming equipment and software for, right? So that's an extra 10 grand that was thrown in there. Under administration, the only change is we're saying recognizing to create an organizational strategic plan. That's your intern, Bob, isn't it? For your management intern?
Yes.
Okay. So we're adding $31,000 there, and then just some other miscellaneous items.
Do we have that intern?
Yeah. Eric Kaltenbacher?
Well, he's the analyst, I'm sorry, not the intern, he's the management
I beg your
analyst.
pardon, you're right.
And that might come up in 2018. We set it aside for 2017 and thought we might bring it in and introduce it as part of the process for the budget process for 2019, 2020 for the next biennial. We've also are looking at the priority-based budgeting is part of that exercise as well. We'll bring that back in 2018, though, for more discussion, most likely at the retreat.
On the 17,800, I see 10 of that is for the equipment and software for the live stream of meetings. What's the other 8 for?
There was 5,000 for Charles Peterson's memorial service, and I can't remember the other, additional meals.
$3,000 for Charles Peterson.
Okay, I was close.
Memorial, and then $5,000 for city-sponsored expenses. So,
Which are what?
given that we've had a number of additional council members, for example, I'm sure we've had additional meetings to support that activity.
Or photographs, or, yeah.
If we need to see right in front of you today as well. Support that.
Carry on.
Okay, thank you. So legal is next. Always an issue, always a troublemaker when it comes to budget time. So there's a pretty big adjustment there of $208,000. And it consists of, we increase the hours of your assistant, I'm sorry, I forget what we're calling her.
You mean her name? Raina McCauley.
Okay, I got it.
Ms. McCauley to you.
Yeah.
Is that what we call it?
That's one of the handicaps of being away for 2 years. I've discovered the fountain of old. Anyway, then we've got an appropriation amount for, I guess you call the defense of our Phase 2A contract misgivings. How much is that? Do you know off the top of your head?
That's probably
It was $150,000. Was that estimated
Yeah.
or incurred?
That's an estimated.
Estimate.
That's an estimated, and that's really just moving the existing funds from Public Works to legal, since I'm the one working with outside counsel. Funds for outside legal services related to that contract were previously being paid from the project fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does that
Pardon me. How does that compare with, you said it's always, legal's always a problem, which we know. How does that compare to previous years and biennial reviews? Is that about right?
Well, I think it's up, isn't it, for,
Excuse me. Well, it's certainly up, because we haven't had a case of this magnitude where there was outside counsel expenditures being funded by the city rather than Washington City's insurance authority.
so yeah, I'd say it's up considerably.
Right. In terms of the wage portion of that, it's been a very slight increase
Modest
in her hours.
increase.
Modest, I think, from 24 to 30, 24 to 28 hours a week.
And we got some legal reference materials and stuff that was added in.
Right, to reflect adjustments. That's primarily for Westlaw Legal Research, computerized legal research services, which we had a new contract this year and increase, as well as some increases due to if you stray into certain databases, suddenly you're paying $100 a minute. So we had some charges for outside of plan research, but it's primarily due to the new contract.
Okay.
May the record note that Councilmember Mayhew showed up at 9 minutes after 5.
Good evening. So we get down to the finance budget, and there's an adjustment of $31,000 there. And as you go through this thing, we had several employees that took the voluntary early retirement option, so you'll see that pop up in Public Works. And our accountant took advantage of that offer and retired in August. So in addition to his payouts, we have an incentive for the plan. And then I guess we bought a couple of sit-stand desks for, this is a big time for the computers. Is that what that is? I can't stand up much anymore, so I'm passing on that. Communications is at a Jones budget, an appropriation adjusted for the use of professional services. And do you remember what that is for?
That was for the website.
Yeah, okay. That should be it for the website, shouldn't it?
Was the website not forecast for that?
Sometimes the
yeah.
project is delayed.
Drew, you may need to use your microphone if you don't mind.
Sorry, so
I can speak to that.
You want to speak to that?
Sure, so the website had a certain budget, and it wasn't all used this year. Some of it will be paid for next year, so it's just, it's not increasing. It's just not being all used right now. Does that make sense?
So is she gonna
The
carry
funds
over?
were in 2017. They're not going to actually be billed until 2018, so it's moving that portion over, Sean.
Right, some of it has been charged in 2017. This is not an enhancement.
Okay.
Yeah,
So we're pulling it from 2018.
from 2017 into 2018,
But is this the general fund 2017?
both.
I don't see 2018 up there at all.
Yeah,
It's coming.
we should adopt it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
and amend
Yes,
it.
you are correct.
Why-
This is,
Okay.
this is the 2017 portion going
So
to-
the people developing our website, it's, in 2017, it's going to cost us 10.6 more than we thought.
It's not costing us any extra. If anything, it's costing less. I haven't looked at these numbers.
We're just moving the appropriation from 17 to 18, so I think you'll see it show up when we get.
As a negative in 2018? Will it show up as a negative in 2018 then?
Well, it'll show up as an increase.
It's showing as an increase here. Do we have the funds going the right way?
It shouldn't cost, it's not gonna cost anymore. It's the amount. I'm not sure how it was written here, but
Joan, if I'm just looking at, this is 2017, and the change is to increase 2017 by 10,000. And the last time you and I talked, you were saying that some of what we were budgeting in 2017 would be picked up in 2018, so it was just moving money. So I would assume that the adopted expenditures would be less than the amended expenditure. So do we have it going the right direction in 2017?
Should be coming out
Or
of
or did you spend more in 2017 and you're going to appropriate that from the 2018 budget? Go the other direction?
I'm sorry, I haven't studied these numbers, but I do know that whatever was, maybe I should go over these numbers with Rob as far as what's in what column, but overall, whatever was budgeted for the website is what will be spent for the website, or less. It might come in at less than was budgeted. There's no additional expenditure, so maybe we can look at that together.
Yeah. So we're showing.
Drew, do you have
this-
any response to my question? Why it's 10,675 more?
So,
I saw you flipping pages. I thought you might be coming up with answers.
I mean, basically, there is a reduction of $9,000 in minor intro tech software for this year. And right now, it's hard to tell exactly where the website is coming from, if that's coming from professional services general or the minor intro tech software. We didn't exactly create a specific line item for the website. Without the comments that are usually a part of the Excel worksheet, I can't really necessarily.
Let's do this. Let's set this one aside, put it in the parking lot, and let's get back to it and get council an answer before the evening's up.
Thank you.
Okay. Police. So there's a big adjustment there. We've discussed it in committees before. Part of it has to do with overtime. And the overtime budget is expected to be $320,000 for the year. We budgeted $250
Who's got the
approximately.
screen for this?
Who's controlling the slides?
There we go.
Thank you, Drew.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Rob, I'm sorry, I was
You're a little busy.
getting disjointed. Would you start over on police?
Okay. So $287,000 adjustment. $87,000 of it is to buy the 2 new police cars for the levy-approved new detectives. That wasn't budgeted, so we're budgeting for it now. I think the cars are bought, right?
Yes.
Correct.
And then the other major change is in overtime. So this is something that we go through periodically. 95% of the overtime in police is shift coverage to maintain a appropriate level of service. The shift coverage has a proportionate relationship to the number of vacancies that the police is carrying, which is where is it? 3, right? We got 3 vacancies up there. So those are the major changes there. I'd like to say that apparently when I mentioned this at the committee meeting some time ago, it became morphed out into the cyber world that the city's total budget was compromised because of overtime. Well, that's not true, and neither is it true that the police budget itself is compromised because we overspent or tend to overspend overtime. Police has $400,000 or $500,000 in salary savings by not being able to fill the 3 positions, so it's nicely offset. But I got that cyber feedback, I guess, that people had made that conclusion based on whatever I said here at the committee meeting some time ago.
So, Rob, there are 3 unfilled positions, which equates to a budget underrun of, you said, between $300,000 and $500,000.
Yeah.
So that's a
Salaries
big
and
range.
benefits.
Hang on. And there's $200,000 additive here for overtime. Does that mean the overtime was $700,000?
No. I'm not sure. So we're adding $127,000 to the overtime budget.
So I think in our meeting, when you went over the budget, 35,000 of the 127,000 is reimbursed, correct?
Right.
And another 75,000 is reimbursed through court fees. And so you have like 105, 110,000 that's reimbursed out of the 127,000.
Correct.
Please, I'm more concerned that there are 3 unfilled positions, so the overall expenditures went down by round numbers, $500,000. I'm now coming in at
But-
$300,000 over budget, so I've got
No.
$800,000 of budget to figure out here.
125,000 over budget.
I
I
believe the
rounded 287 up.
But the 2 positions that were funded through the levy were not in the 2017 budget, correct?
They were in the budget.
Yeah.
They were?
Yes. They were
What?
funded through the levy.
They're vacant.
Okay, I didn't think we budgeted for any of that.
We did report it with those.
Okay, so I'm going to jump on Brian's bandwagon. Why are we not seeing that as an adjustment down then?
You mean the overtime?
No, I'm talking about the 3 positions that were budgeted for but not filled. So we haven't spent that money, but we're not showing it as a change here.
So we budgeted for roughly $500,000 in salaries to be paid to 3 police officers that were never hired, not yet hired.
Right.
So that seems like it should be a minus 500,000 plus the 127,000, whatever. That should be a negative number.
Well,
So I
go
would
ahead.
say part of the problem is our attention is limited, and so we have to focus on those items that are likely to increase between the adopted budget for 17 as well as the amended budget for 17. In addition, the salary portion for every police officer is broken up into lots of different accounts. And we've got a special payroll worksheet where we need to keep track of all this. Summarizing that for council is very difficult, and then trying to get those numbers into here is equally just as complicated as well. So
So because we haven't adjusted for those vacant positions, the net effect is that those funds will remain in the ending fund balance at the end of the year.
correct.
You're just not making a budget adjustment for them.
That's right.
So basically, the process is you go through the budget and you determine what you're changing. They didn't recognize that one of the things that we should probably change is those 3 positions. Because Drew is correct, they're scattered between all of the various payroll taxes, benefit lines, salary lines.
And the police
And so
program,
those funds are just sitting there appropriated, but we're not going to actually show an expenditure. So by not making an adjustment, it effectively just adds to the ending fund balance as funds not expended at 2017.
Yes, that we can carry over to 2018.
So then where are we going to see ending fund balance for the general fund and the change?
Well, yeah.
So we don't anticipate having that information available for you today. In earlier presentations that we had presented, we did have that information available.
So maybe, Councilmember Pruitt, you can help me out with this. What I'm just trying to focus on, see, maybe I don't understand the columns. There's a column 217 amended expenditures. Are we saying that we think that's what the actual was or is?
So the adopted expenditures would be what we adopted last year at this time, saying that we were going to spend 4.5 million in police services.
Yep.
The amended expenditures are today's guess at what we will spend in 2017. You're amending it for recognized expenditures. That 4.8 million still has the 3 positions in it fully loaded.
It does. I would also, there's this,
The 4.5 had.
I don't know if I'm probably the most appropriate person to describe this. Jerry Knutson is better at describing this, but we have a legal obligation to the state of Washington to make sure that no fund goes above what we appropriate in the ordinance. So it's a balancing act between trying to demonstrate to council what's actual and what our maximum limit we're trying to set should be, so that we're careful not to.
So in the for-profit world, we all start with 4.5, and at the end of the year, we get a variance of plus or minus off of actuals. You're not actually looking at actuals here, and that's a mind chip that you kind of have to play with a little bit. At the end of the year, they will actually show you the actual expenditures and compare it to adopted, amended, and actual.
Yeah.
So you can see that math play out correctly.
So if in my mind, if I thought of that category as 2017 amended expenditure authority or something like that,
Basically, yes.
I'd correctly understand that column.
Because by law, you can't spend over.
Yeah.
You can't.
You can underspend, you can't overspend.
You can't under budget basically and spend actual above your appropriation, because they don't have the authority. That's what we have to do. That's what this exercise is a little bit about.
And just so we're clear, if I can just step back even further, we obviously budget at the line item level for each department in the general fund. And then we obviously go to the department level, and then we go to the general fund. What Drew was describing there was the state law pertains to the general fund in totality, not each department.
True.
So it has to reconcile at the bottom line for the entire general fund. So for instance, police might be overexpending, or have the authority to overexpend based on the amended versus the adopted budget. But at the bottom, when you total up fire and administration, finance, everybody else, that total cannot exceed what I'll call the amended expenditure authority at the end of the year.
So weren't the 2 police cars also budgeted in 2017?
No, they were not budgeted. So all we did was budget the positions that were approved in public safety levy, but all the additional costs associated with bringing those 2 police officers on board, we left that out of the budget until we could figure out those costs, or at least could better predict what those costs would be. So now that we know that we need 2 police detective vehicles, we can now incorporate that in the budget through this amendment process.
So my last question on the police item is $84,000 overage in professional services, training, firearms, and other items. Unless I'm not understanding correctly, it seems like a big miss. Why we didn't see that in this time last year? Why was there such $84,000 is a lot of extra money for those 3 items, I think.
So I would,
Perhaps
you want to
Perry,
take this one?
Perry perhaps
Actually,
even expound on it.
Chief, isn't part of that the recruiting and all the testing you have to do, which we have had a lot of testing?
It is. It is a significant amount, but when you take into consideration just in the background process, it can take $10,000 to $12,000 just for one background process. And we've done 5, I believe, this year, just in the background process. So they'll vary between $5,000 and $12,000.
I guess, and no one's more frustrated by this than you, is we have all these expenses and we don't have any more police officers.
Yes,
Right?
You're right.
So
It's a tough environment for everybody out there
Yeah.
trying to find out.
Not for want of trying.
It's part of the industry.
I think I went in depth at
Yeah.
our committee meeting regarding that, and I think,
We actually had quite a lengthy discussion on recruiting and some new strategies to perhaps explore, because it is a brutally
You want to take
hard recruiting environment out there. And then once you get individuals in, they still have to pass a pretty tough litany of tests.
no matter what, when this was passed and approved for 2 new positions, you would never have seen those, no matter what you would have done, for almost a year, no matter what. So even if everything went well and you hired somebody within the first month or 2 of this being passed, they would just be seeing the patrol by themselves, probably right about now. Because of the academy and the training, FTO training, and the background process depends on how long that takes. So no matter what, it takes a long time. And you throw in losing 2 additional officers within the first 2 months of this year. Throw that in with already being down positions. It makes it difficult. So we have been hiring in this process. It's not like we have not had any hiring during this whole process. Since I've been here, I think I've hired 4, possibly 5. 5th one's in the academy right now. So I think that's still, under the conditions that we have today, that's still pretty good that we're doing that under the situation that we have. So just because of the way that the setup is for a police officer and the training that's required, it just couldn't have been any quicker as far as that goes. I mean, right at this point sitting today, I would be as happy as could be if I had 2 detectives sitting in that detective office by March or April. I would be happy as could be. That's my goal, but I don't know if I'll meet that.
But I don't mind it being a high hurdle to get you employees, because your employees are on the street with guns. We need to be of the right people, so spend what it takes to get the right people.
Well,
with guns.
and I agree with that. I mean, this is one position where you can't make concessions.
Yeah.
First of all, you're going to have them there for 30 years. They have a right to take people's liberty, including their life. I have to be protective of them, too. I don't want to put an inferior officer out on the street. It's not just for the public, although that's number one. It's also for the officer, too. I want to feel comfortable when an officer's out there by themselves that they can do the job. So I'm not going to lower my standards just because I need to get them, because then we're stuck for 20 to 30 years with that officer. And to be honest with you, with the conditions that we have now and the expectations of law enforcement, you need the best. You can't compromise.
I should point out that the overtime budget in police is $50,000 less than it was in 2016. And in 18, we're hopefully being optimistic at budgeting it at $250,000, assuming we're going to have some immediate relief when we get new employees on board in March.
Can you specifically tell me how much of that 127,000 of overtime is reimbursed, will be reimbursed?
In other words, related to special events.
Special events, firefighter, or not firefighter, but whatever.
We had 35,000 being reimbursed and 17,000 through court fees.
So
About
42?
110,000
What's that? Yeah.
out of the
And then
127,000.
the fines and forfeits is about $75,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So other people have paid for about 100,000 of that $127,000.
Close to 110,000.
Yeah, we bill out for contracted overtime, like the Boeing Classic is a big bill. And the court overtime, not much we can do about it. Costs a couple $100 to go over there and defend a citation or something like that, and the guy gets fined $180. So there's never a true up between, of course, these guys don't control the fines. Thank goodness I'd be broke.
I want to make sure we're clarifying, though, the 127,000 is in addition to the overtime that we budgeted.
Yes.
So it's,
Yeah.
so the total amount,
Right.
just so we're clear.
So the stuff that's reimbursed is not countering that 127?
Well, I guess you can make an argument that it counters everything at police. It's a general fund revenue that we get back.
Right. But it comes in because it's overtime.
Well, it is caused by overtime in the case of courts. So somebody that contests a citation can have the officer in court on the prosecutor's side, right? So we pay the officer for that, but the court fine and that might emanate out of that is very rarely, if ever, going to cover our costs in prosecuting the ticket.
But,
So,
wait a minute, so the court fines and the reimbursed overtime comes in and is booked at the general fund level.
Yeah, right.
And
Yes.
will add to, in essence, this case, the ending fund balance for the general fund. Does not, those revenues do not boil down to the police line item. So
They're not,
gotta do the
in our
separation.
system of accounting, they're not acquainted with police on the books. But in
So-
pure times, the department does generate them.
so the department generates the overtime for various reasons. It can be special events, which is reimbursable. It can be from just pure staffing needs. It can be demanded by the courts. In the first case where it is reimbursable, you show the expense as a line item, as an expense. You show the reimbursement as part of your revenue stream. So that's why you see one is not washing through. So you have to look at the two figures gross and offset them that way.
And just so we're clear, that's not an option that we have.
That's-
It's required. It all-
That's accounting, and I think in Councilmember Mayhew's world, we'd get in trouble if we netted them.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges, I think, but I know it's particularly worse in government accounting, but is to try and show the revenue that offsets the expense, because what everyone is saying is correct. They're not connected in the books and records, but yet we know them to be connected. And so if we can, in the future, maybe find ways, I think this is the second presentation where I've seen, regarding the budget, where I've seen the conversation get a little hung up on something that's in fact being reimbursed. Because it's just hard for us sitting here to, well, we don't see it from that slide, and then you have to explain it to us, and we get a little caught up in that explanation. So if there's a way for us to think about other ways to present this where we clearly show the offsetting revenue, that might just get us through these things a little bit faster. I know they're not
And it's not just us.
legally connected.
It's people paying attention out in the public.
Yeah, and I would even suggest a different way of doing it, and that is looking at connecting it to an actual activity.
That's right.
Because the revenue doesn't, and the expenditure won't necessarily offset each other. For instance, so if the police department, if there's an event that someone requests or requires that they have overtime, or police staffing that, it'll be an overtime item, because he's not, obviously Perry's not gonna deploy officers who are already on the street, on a shift, so there'd be additional. And we should look at those types of activities. I think council better understand that, because there's not gonna be offsetting revenues versus expenditures. We can never explain that part. We can certainly try, but I would suggest that overtime hours matching up to the actual responsibilities and the activities that go with that, because some of that, as we just mentioned, the court, we're not gonna get fully reimbursed, but we do get reimbursed, I think, almost dollar for dollar for the activity. It's a full cost recovery. For instance, if there's a special event that someone's required to have officers, that is a fully reimbursable expense.
Yes, it is.
It could be as simple as not looking at expenditures in isolation, but instead looking at police and showing both the expenditures and the revenue side on this slide, because you would show the offsetting revenue potential.
Again, I'd rather go by activity, because we've been explaining to department after department after department that they do not have offsetting revenues. Fire, police, administration, those folks can't receipt that as their revenues. It's a general fund revenue. I'll make sure we're very clear with that with council as well.
No, I think your activity comment is right on, and I think if you could do that, you would help us out tremendously to understand what it is that we're, how much of this is, that there's revenue related to it, and how much that is versus how much is just expenditure that's on its own. It would just help us focus a lot better and understand it.
I think it'll help with all of our departments and all the activities that we go through in overtime. We could easily explain that the difference between what I'll call fully fully funded overtime versus, obviously overtime that's not fully recoverable.
Sure.
You know, what you're requesting, we actually have that. In fact, I have it hours-wise. It's not money, but Deanna, my assistant, she is extraordinary in keeping data. And she not only has it broken down to what activities they have, but each officer. So it's not just the activity and how much it costs. She actually has a line that has each officer. So I can look at it and go, this officer worked way too many overtime hours this year. So I'm looking at more of a workforce type work performance issue. But you can take this form right here and I can see, okay, shift coverage vacation. That means, so I'm also cutting it down to shift coverage down to what for. Was it for training? Was it for vacation? Was it shift strength? So we even got it down to that level. And that's a majority of our hours, 600 hours for one, 600 hours for shift coverage, 650 hours for shift coverage vacation. So right there is over 1,200 hours just on coverage of shift strength. So we do have what you're asking for at our level of what, so we are tracking all this. And I agree with you that when you look up there and see $127,000 in overtime, it puts up the red flags. And I said this when I first saw it. But when you look at it and say, what does that mean? You have to look other places. What that means is you're not getting what is being reimbursed because it's not being shown here. That would help out a lot. Also, what would help out a lot, sorry. Also, what would help out a lot is to show that a majority of that is that because we're down, we've talked about, you have to supplement that with another officer on overtime. And so that's going to raise that overtime budget up. And so if you've been down for 12 months, let's just say 2 officers down for 2 months, at time and a half, that equates to 3 officers. So now your budget, overtime budget is like that. That's why it looks like that. But you have to do that to give the service that we give.
Chief, maybe at the committee level, maybe, I don't know, quarterly basis, you could present, at least in your department, and fire as well, during firefighting season in the summer, we're going to incur, overtime expenses that are eventually going to come back to us. Maybe reviewing that on a quarterly basis so we can understand, how much that event-based thing that Bob was talking about, that we can just understand, oh yeah, Boeing Classic did this, and we got about this much back.
Okay.
It just helps.
I'd actually put it in your written report.
Yeah, perfect. Will do.
So, just so I'm clear, I'm sort of focusing on Councilmember Holloway's point. Are you saying that based on the information you're looking at, and I understand it's hours, not dollars, so you don't know exactly, but is your general sense that most of that 127,000 is due to being down officers as opposed to other things?
Absolutely. I have a pie chart that shows it's like 67% is shift strength or shift coverage.
All right, well,
Yeah.
I think
the discretionary overtime being used is very, very limited. It's very, very limited, and those hours are the only ones that we really have the ability to increase or decreases are, when we have discretion. Shift coverage is not discretion. Court's not discretion, and that's a majority of what we have.
And Chief, I assume the two additional detectives, when they come on board, will improve that situation?
The hope is yes. It's going to take them a year probably to get going, but yes, we hope that will help. They'll also be able to flex in. So instead of using overtime when we can, and they don't have the workload in a detective position, they will actually be able to work a patrol shift at straight time, at their regular straight time. That'll help the overtime. That's one thing that we put in to try and make our overtime better, so we're not using it as much. But they will get a small amount for on-call, one of them a week, because they have to be able to be called out at night for a crime. That's part of being a detective. And so there's some minimal amounts of cost there, but it's like 10 hours a week or something to that effect. So, but I will do that, Councilman Sandel.
Well, good discussion. Thank you. We'll pay some attention. It's not the first time that it's come up. I think maybe we've been a little resistant about showing it, but.
Well, for good reason that's been discussed here, but if you give some thought to this back and forth, I think maybe you'll find some. One thing, though, I just want to double back with you on is, would you give some thought just into the future on this titling of the categories, so 2017 amended expenditures. I don't think that's what that column is, as the conversation kind of covered here. Well, it's not forecast either. It's an expenditure authority. That's the word I use. It's sort of a maximum amount.
It is.
And I,
Right.
although I don't know if that's even the right word. So perhaps you could give some thought to that. And the reason I want to make this point is these slides are viewed by citizens who are not here to take part in this conversation. And so I think we need to be mindful of how those words might be misunderstood. And to the extent that they think that those are in fact the expected expenditures, and we all know that they aren't, then I think we're perhaps leading them astray.
Okay, good
Yeah,
point.
you could use the word authority or perhaps even appropriation or something like that, yeah, it'd be fine. We'll figure out something
Okay.
that fits our jargon in the public sector.
So we're doing this for, I was going to say cosmetic reasons, but that's probably not a good word to use. I want to assure you that, if you decided not to pass the amendments, there is not a single budget in the general fund that is in danger of going over. We are trying to correct for things that were not anticipated when the original budget was put together. And of course, the entire city budget is not in danger of going over because of overtime or any other reason.
I would also say that we're also recognizing what was approved by council during the entire year as well. So through the agenda bill process, the council action that you guys have, council members have decided upon is reflected in this amended budget as well.
But it's expenditures only. Case in point on fire, at least from the conversation we heard, the tally in my head says we're gonna be 200, his overall expenditures will be about 200,000 thereabouts under budget.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Speaking of fire.
Unless you can figure something to spend real quick.
So we have pretty much the same drill there. Most of, I won't take your thunder away, but
No, you can steal my thunder.
most of your shift coverage, most of your overtime is shift coverage. And you've been down a couple positions before I got here, but you're,
Yeah, we're full staff. I can
okay?
take it. You want me to just talk about the overtime piece? Is that the goal?
Yeah. Quick.
Quickly, yeah, so our hiring issues aren't as near as complex as what law enforcement has been going through or goes through. So we were fortunate to run our process in October, November last year, so that on January 14th, we brought our employee on board for the levy process. But with that, just because they come on board doesn't mean they count towards our staffing levels. So there was about a 4.5-month gap between when the person started and when she was fully qualified to work as a firefighter. We worked through that. End of, I want to say April is when Teresa Tozier was qualified and became part of the fully staffing. So there was 4 months of overtime usage for the days that we were short-staffed. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was probably 20 shifts that we had to fill with overtime. That's one of the adjustments that's being made for the overtime piece because that wasn't planned or projected in the budget. The other piece is similar to law enforcement. We have some special events that the firefighters go on. The Bowling Classic is the big one that we get reimbursed for. We also have a shared staffing agreement with Falls City and Duval where our firefighters will work in their fire station. They will compensate the city for those expenditures. And similarly, we'll provide staffing into Duval or vice versa. They'll come into our city and we'll pay them to do those services. And then lastly, we have our wildland firefighter response. We had one firefighter that went to Eastern Washington 2 or 3 times this past season. During the red card season, we get reimbursed for the time with that. They are gone and for the backfill hours for anybody that has to work for them. So it's kind of a net neutral dollar for the fire department. But those dollars come in revenues back to the city, like what the city administrator was just discussing. Although we don't count on those dollars, this just reflects that adjustment of we get those revenues back. So to actively get a good sense of how much we're spending on overtime, that's why we make these adjustments. We too, like police, we too break out we self-contain the costs of overtime for training, for staffing, for late call is what we'll call it. There'll be an incident that comes in at 7:45 in the morning, so the crew has to go out late on it or vice versa, or we have a major incident where we have to call them back. And then we have also a special piece for special projects, which would be something that needs to be pre-approved beforehand. But we scrutinize the overtime. In fact, I scrutinized an hour and a half of overtime today for one of the firefighters for training. He asked for approval. It was denied because it really didn't fit into his growth plan and his performance plan that we had in place. So it's it's watched after quite closely.
Chief, can you also make that a part of the report that you put in, like
Certainly.
Chief Phipps? Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
And Chief, it's a similar thing like Boeing Classic. Again, some of the guys perhaps work overtime for that, and we get reimbursed for that sort of a special event as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
So emergency management is the next small category, and I forget the allocation, but the chief and the administrative services is allocated 25 or 50%, both of you.
Yeah, and I can explain the reasons why. Really quickly, the emergency management budget has half of my salary and half of the administrative assistant salary in there. The reason why we do that is to qualify for grant funds through the federal government and through the state called emergency management program grants. You have to have at least 1/2 of an FTE assigned to that budget. So it's a budgeting exercise that we do, and it allows us to have access to those dollars. We get about $6,500 a year through the state for the city, but we also have an emergency management organization that's been established with North Bend, Carnation, Duval, and Snoqualmie, so that we actually capture all those dollars internally, and then we expend those dollars back to those cities. Those cities weren't getting those dollars. We were threatened to lose those dollars, but by pooling our populations, we actually keep those. So it's an accounting issue, is the reason why we break out half of those salaries into the emergency management side.
And the administrative assistant retired, took the early voluntary retirement, so there's an adjustment in that budget for those costs. Parks. So I think we've kind of covered the major expenditures in parks. $158,000 is adjusted for I'm getting these mixed up, for under budgeting water and sewer utility bills to the park, which the utilities cannot subsidize the general fund department, so they got to pay their fair share. And then we were under budgeted for the landscape contract. God, I'm $136,000. So, and I explained before, when I went through and looked at this, the Northwest Landscape Service has the contract here, and it looks like we dropped a digit when that thing was budgeted. It's $15,000 a month. It should have been, and I think we budgeted 90, well under it. So that's on finance. Same with the utilities. It's always been a problem for us to figure out what fair share Parks has to pay of utilities. I think they worked on that while I was bugged out of here. But again.
But, sorry, also to help, the $136,000, we didn't realize what the rate increases were going to be. And with the dry summer, I mean, there was an increase in cost with irrigation, so that accounts for the dollar amount. Sorry.
Well, it was a big chunk of it, so I attributed it to, it looked like we misplaced a digit. What else are we doing there? So once again, the operations manager in Parks and Public Works took the early retirement, so there's an adjustment in there for Nancy Davidson leaving. And what did we do on street trees? We took 50 grand out, moved it to 18?
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason we did that is working with Phil, there's going to be a significant savings in combining 2 years, obviously, bulk volume. That's why we all go to Costco. So we're going to get a lot more street trees for the $100,000 than we would in 2 individual $50,000 years. So Phil's doing a great job in managing that, and so that's why the carryover.
Okay.
I don't know what other items are.
That's it.
Okay.
Not in this non-departmental classification, we've got a mixed mash of things that aren't necessarily acquainted with any one department. The municipal court is one of them. The prosecuting attorney is another. Are we still using Lynn Moberly, Bob?
Yes, prosecuting attorney Lynn Moberly, yes.
Has she changed her rate?
Has not changed her rate since...
40 years.
Yeah, well, been about 12 years, actually.
It's about $4,500 a month for her services. And we apparently missed a 30% rate increase from the municipal court. They bill us on a case-by-case basis. It's a variable rate based on the type of case, criminal, traffic, And I don't know, we just, oversight on our part. So we've added $25,000 to the budget to account for that. How about the general fund in 2018? Okay, so, oh, wait a minute. Did we miss the, no, I missed the city clerk up there, but all we're doing there is taking 50,000 bucks. Why do we have this fancy name for your records management system? What's it called?
Because it's a fancy system.
Oh, okay. So we didn't spend all of that this year. We're reallocating it for
2018.
2018. Okay, so in the administration for 2018, which is the top of the next page, again, this is just a repeat of one earlier. We're taking $56,000 out of 17 that wasn't spent, reappropriating it in 18. City clerk, same deal. Finance, same deal. We're making an adjustment for the voluntary retirement program. Communications, same deal, only it's 9,000 bucks we're allocating for the website. Right?
All right, so let's discuss this a little bit. I would appreciate the opportunity to go back and take a look at the communications budget at this point so that I can figure out what's going on there. The information that Jerry so thankfully went back to check on, essentially there's multiple accounts inside the communications budget that is paying for the website project. Councilmember Sunwald, Jerry went back to try to figure out exactly what we were doing in that situation. It appears that we're trying to allow some flexibility for Joan to spend those dollars in either 17 or 18 because we're uncertain whether she's going to be able to complete the project in 17 or 18. So we were providing the communications with some flexibility in that manner. We don't anticipate that they're going to spend over their budget. In fact, she's been up here to assure us that she won't in that situation. But as a budgeting exercise, we wanted to make sure that we had the appropriate authority for 17 and 18, just in case it happened now and completed now, or happened or completed in 18. So the professionals line item is tied to that. The agenda bill that was put forward, which was AB 17056, references that account, that professional services account, in the budget section there. So we know it is definitely tied to the website. I probably just did not insert the proper language into this presentation, and I apologize for that.
So we booked the project to complete both in 17 and 18?
So we're uncertain whether it's going to finish in 17 or 18, so we made sure that the dollars were available in both years in case either occurrence happened.
You have to appropriate
Almost
funds.
December is my only comment, but go ahead.
So the website will finish this year. There is a $7,500 fee in 2018 and every year thereafter for maintenance, support, and hosting. But that is included in this $38,000 investment, enhancement. So the total billing for 2017 will be $30,636.06. And then next year it'll be $7,500. So we'll be short $136.03.
So
Way to pinpoint.
Well, I felt under pressure, so I went upstairs and did the math.
You said $136.03?
Minus, yeah.
Okay.
Over.
Sure.
However, I must admit that I didn't factor in the tax. So there might be tax on the $7,500. So there's that.
That's very good. Thank you for the summary.
Where the heck are we? So we're filtering through fire, emergency management, which again has the voluntary retirement program. Some of these people have elected to take COBRA, which is the post-retirement health benefits, and so that's why it's lapping over into successive years. COBRA is an 18-month.
However, my understanding of COBRA is it's completely on the employee. that is left to pay the COBRA, is there a city portion of that
For
with
the-
this program that we're running?
For the voluntary, yes, there's expenditure up to, I believe, $25,000 for that incentive. And then, so it'll overlap if they elect the COBRA or the payment for health insurance, it'll go from 1 year to the next, so it's 18 months.
Okay.
Or $25,000, whatever occurs first.
If an employee leaves the city under normal retirement, whatever, and opts to take COBRA, the city is not paying anything for that. It's
That's
only
correct.
this early retirement program.
That's correct.
Okay.
Can you, I'm new to this early retirement thing, but there's been a lot of it talked about today. Can you help me, I know we're short on time, but and just as quickly as possible, help me understand what it is and why we have it?
You want to take that, or?
Sure. This was, not sure exactly when it started, but we've offered it twice, and we're actually going to pull the agenda bill for tonight because we inadvertently, in the narrative, had a language from the previous, original program, and it also was an error and a date. But anyway, the first program was to cite the issues we had coming out of the recession. We experienced, and we can certainly pull up the information based on each of the retirees, but we were trying to offer incentives for higher paid employees or the potential for layoffs for some employees to take an early retirement. And as part of that incentive, we would pay either $25,000 towards health insurance and/or $25,000 towards a contribution towards, I believe it was the deferred compensation, or $25,000 in cash. And we obviously were, from that, we're expecting that these were generally, the employees were at the top of the scale in their categories for positions. And so we would, if we had to replace it, sometimes we didn't, and I can explain that in a few minutes, we would hire obviously someone at a lower step. And then we would, over the next 2 or 3 succeeding years until that new replacement reached the top step, we would experience some savings involved with that, not only on salary, but also on potentially on health insurance and/or in pension contributions, so on and so forth. In a couple of cases, we actually had a couple employees who were not replaced. One that comes to mind immediately is Gary Stevens. He was a supervisor for the streets department. We have not replaced that position. And so we've had a fairly large savings over time with that particular person. We just felt we could shift the responsibilities over to some other members in that division, and/or take some of those other responsibilities and shift them over to the other folks who worked in public works and general fund activities.
So are these, is this for any employee, or is it a certain level of employee? Is it something that's built into their contract, or is it something that can come and go? Like, now that we're in better times, do we not offer this anymore?
We are going to bring it back. The second time we offered it was for similar circumstances, but it's not for anyone. It has to be a qualifying employee, so they have to be of retirement eligibility. And there's different ways you can approach that. For instance, if you're, say, law enforcement or fire, there's thresholds or limits or minimum that you have to reach if you want to retire. For a regular employee who's under, state offers the left, which is the law enforcement and officers and firefighter, LEOFF, is a separate pension than the PERS, which is the regular public employee retirement system, which would be for all others who are not law enforcement and/or police or fire. So they have to be eligible to obviously receive a pension, and generally they are, no matter how many years you put in. But typically we want somebody who's nearer the Social Security, if they are eligible for Social Security. In our case, I'm going too deep here on this issue, but for instance, firefighters, when we restarted the fire service back in 1999, we offered those folks an option to have Social Security. They opted out. Deborah reminded me today that when they talked about that with those folks, I wasn't here at the time, but Deborah was, that those folks opted out of the Social Security system. They wanted the money in their paycheck. So that was so obviously those folks wouldn't necessarily, if you're looking at someone who would be eligible under the firefighter system, they wouldn't necessarily have Social Security eligibility, but they would have pension eligibility under the state left system, the law enforcement officer and firefighter. So there's other minimum qualifications. There also has to be an element that person wouldn't be how to describe it, couldn't present an issue for the organization or the department whereby their retirement could cause some issues with that. We have, for instance, we have some positions we have to fill. Say it's a police officer, firefighter, we would normally have to fill that position.
Okay, thank you, that's perfect.
One of the benefits that Bob didn't talk about, at least in the first go-around, is we're also looking at staffing, and the city has been afforded with very long-serving employees, to the point where when you started looking at some of the groups, pretty much going kind of in a similar age group. So by having early retirement, being able to bring on some younger employees, you end up with a little succession planning through that. So it was not only cost savings, but it was also a management tool to make sure that we had really efficient, turnover as folks do start retiring.
Yes, and I thank you. I apologize for not remembering that piece. There's another element I want to mention, that is that it can't be a retirement or resignation and then thereby that employee leaves service with the city and joins another organization or goes into the private sector. We wanted to be very careful about that too. You can't necessarily control for those folks who want to leave the public sector, go to the private sector, but you can control for those folks who would want to leave our organization and join another public agency, and then they would start another pension system perhaps under a different program. We obviously want to avoid that at all costs.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Okay. So
Isn't the 25, it's up to 25 based on years of service, is it not?
I believe so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And both times we've offered it in the past, it's been for a very finite time period that it was available.
Usually when the council had approved the last two times, there was a enrollment or application period followed by a not to exceed, I think it was generally 120 days by which you had to retire or leave service. And thank you. I forgot about the cap. Well, it's based on, I think it's $1,000 for each year of service.
Up to 25.
Up to 25,000, yes, thank you.
Okay, why don't we drop down to non-departmental on page 3? Or excuse me, the other general funds, I beg your pardon. The first one there is 011, fire equipment replacement. And all we're doing is moving a previously approved allocation for the self-contained breathing apparatus. That's a piece of equipment that we have to buy because the chief spends so much time underwater. We don't want him to drown.
We want to drop the U in that, Rob. It's not scuba, it's SCBA. So.
Oh, sorry. Self-contained.
You're going to confuse some people out here when you say those things, Rob.
God.
Touchy. Anyway, the chief has delayed this because there may be an opportunity for some grants to pay for it next year.
Right?
Yeah. And Mark should explain further that this is not one of those we like to have. We absolutely are required and mandated to replace this equipment.
Yeah, there's replaceable lifespans on this, and we're coming to the end of that. In 2019, the bottles will no longer be able to be replaced. So when you do that, it's time to replace the apparatus, and there's new technologies that's out there. Our goal is to apply, as we've done in the previous year, is to apply for what's known as a Fire Act grant. It's a federal grant where they've appropriated dollars for fire equipment like this. And in fact, what we may end up doing is applying as a standalone grant, but we also have the ability to do a regional grant. So we can apply with another agency for the same amount of thing to try to get two stabs at it, if you will. It is an expensive endeavor. It's something that we have to do every about 20 years. So it's not something that, although we're seeing it now in this lifespan, it's something that goes over a longer period of time. One challenge with the grant processes right now is the dollars are tied up right now in committee. We've taken action both internally as the fire department and legislatively at the state and federal level to try to move these out of committee at the federal level. And obviously there's some things going on in DC that's preventing that from occurring. But our goal is to, if the opportunity presents itself, is to apply for grants to fund this program.
So Chief, these are a national standard that requires these bottles to be replaced, correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's the National Fire Protection Agency is the NFPA standard is the one who establishes those standards. And it has to do with how they certify the bottles. Every year they have to do a visual inspection inside the bottle, and then every think it's every 3 years, they actually have to go down and be hydro tested, where they fill them up to extreme pressures to make sure they don't explode. They only can do that so many times, and then the bottle has to be replaced, and we move them off cycle, and we're getting to the point where we're gonna hit that end of the road with that equipment.
I mean, I ask in part just because for the benefit of the new council members, that for that reason, much of this equipment, which is otherwise very valuable, is worthless in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. We see that especially with our turnout gear. There's been a new standard that's been established that says you should only wear your turnout gear. That's the firefighting gear that we wear, the coats and the pants and the boots and the helmets, for no longer than 10 years is the standard that's out there. So what we've been doing is taking them for 10 years frontline. And these aren't standards that we establish. These are consensus standards that the national standard, the National Fire Protection Agency is the one who identifies those standards. We've actually moved those frontline for 10 years and then 5 years as a backline. So what we end up doing is, if we end up having our gear go out of service to be inspected, which we're required to do at least quarterly, and have them professionally evaluated to make sure that we don't get hurt in it, we use that backup gear that's technically out of compliance, but because the gear is still in really good shape, that we feel comfortable using it that way. That's one example of a piece of equipment that comes up, you look at it and you're like, why are we having to get rid of this gear? But it's because of the national standard. And what we do with this equipment is we actually have been shipping it down to Peru. They've been using it down in Peru for their fire department system. They have a lot less stringent programs that are there that require them to certify and inspect those things. And
Or their equipment is far inferior to this stuff that would be surplus. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
So I just wanted, that's what I wanted you to kind of quit you to shorten the conversation in the future so they understand when we're surplusing, we're not giving away value. It's stuff that otherwise has a little value, but great value to a department down in our sister city, for example.
Yeah, exactly. The sister cities and other Peruvian agencies, they've actually built a relationship with a Firefighters Crossing Borders group so they can actually ship more equipment down there and other places. Our challenge, anyway, I won't even get into something.
That's all, thank you.
You should get Nicole, Mrs. Sanders, to do your grants for you. She has the golden touch.
They'd be available.
So in arts and activities, this is you guys are going to have to help me with this. The city has had an arts program. It cannot get rid of these artsy people around here. Just, they're a great bunch of folks that are responsible for a lot of neat events in town, and incidentally, the decoration, the artwork in our lobby downstairs and up. So I'm not so sure what this event is, but we put about $6,000 a year into the arts fund. Nicole gets a grant from for culture occasionally, and so this is her. You want to talk about what that dough is for?
Yeah, we get, I think, $4,500 from For Culture every year, and.
Or Nicole, can you back up a little bit, just again for the new council members, let them know what is For Culture?
Sorry, For Culture is a King County umbrella organization that dispenses art grants throughout the county. So we apply every year for operational funding from For Culture to reimburse for our programming. So that goes into the overall Arts Commission budget, and it's usually helps support the art walks that we host, between 4 to 6 of them, depending on the year, as well as art classes. So I believe the $3,000 increase is from actually one of our art walks this year. That was ticket revenue. This year, we actually shifted to cooperatively running the art walks with the gallery / Mount Si Artists Guild downtown. So a lot of the receipts and invoicing will now be handled on their books, which is better for us. But we did actually take in additional revenue from the one art walk that we officially hosted as a city. So, and we have the numbers of attendees are increased substantially over the years. So I think we averaged last year between 80 and 90, and this year we're averaging more like 130, 140 attendees a walk. So it's getting big enough that it's nice to kind of shift it a bit more into the community. But that's why I think that $3,000 addition has been posted here today.
And their revenue sources are often lodging tax and 1% for the arts, I believe, or for culture. I don't know if you know more about that.
I don't actually know For Culture's revenue base that well, but I believe that is correct in terms of lodging tax, at least countywide.
So the city passed an ordinance some time ago that allocated 1% of construction projects to the arts. except it can't include the utilities, which is where most of our work is these days. So I don't know if you guys changed how you're funding that?
No, and the
No.
county actually does a similar program with 1% that helps fund portion of the floriculture monies that get distributed around King County vis-à-vis a grant program.
So the last discussion point in this is we've added about, we've shifted some money around for environmental sustainability. This is a separate fund. And we have three major facets to this going on. Now, you started the weatherization program this year, Mayor, or Nicole. And so we're carrying that on in 2018. Plus this climate action strategy and the City Hall solar build-out. We funded this with an annual allocation to the fund, plus we're putting the renewable energy credit from the existing solar panels into it, correct? Yeah, yeah, we are. Any questions about that or the three programs? Or?
So
You are frowning.
Well, we started with, well, you told me all goodness, but it's not what I'm seeing here. We started with 171,000, we expect to spend 25,000?
Sure.
Yeah, that's because the solar project, we thought we would launch that this year, and we are going to be building that next year. And so by the time all the paperwork starts running and we're paying invoices, the solar project, and this is of the original size, so we can get into the amendment for the expansion later, but we're not writing checks until next year on that. So the whole solar project
The solar project
is
moves next year.
And then the 15,000 of climate action plan, that's moving because I didn't get to it this year. And then the weatherization campaign, we're spending 25, I think, out of the 35 total or something this year. So that's what we're keeping, and the rest is getting reallocated to next year.
Okay.
Okay.
And your clean energy credits, can you repeat the statement you made?
We have, what, 5 or 7 years of energy credits that we're getting from
Right.
the state because of the initial investment in the 9 kilowatts that's on the roof now.
Mm-hmm.
That's
So
that Washington State production incentive.
Yeah.
Right.
I called it a renewable energy tax credit, but she's right. It's a production tax credit.
Right.
So
That's-
that money is going into this fund.
So why is
when
it
you say
not-
this fund, it's going into the general fund?
No.
So why, or
You guys
why are,
established a separate fund for this while I was gone without my permission.
so I'm a little confused because earlier Bob said the revenue's going to the general fund, but this seems to be going into a particular fund.
It is in the general fund.
But it's going to a specific, let's call it an account within the
Right.
general fund, which is contrary to the practice we had on
Police and
fire
fire.
and police.
I think the distinction here is it's a restricted revenue, is it not? Whether it's a production credit or a grant, it's a revenue that's restricted to that type of an expenditure, so it can't.
Is it a revenue or is it a credit on your expenses?
I believe they send us back a check for
Yeah.
our production.
Okay, so it is
and
revenue.
Yeah, and I don't believe that you then have to spend that money again on renewable
Okay,
items.
so the check, the check says spend however you like, it's general fund money.
We produce so many kilowatts above our need, and we sold that back to the utility.
Well, and that's slightly different. The sale of
Than this.
it's a little differently. The money that we get back for the energy generation and the production credit are
State.
two money sources on
Okay.
some level. So, but I believe there was a decision at some point that they just stay in this fund to be reinvested towards additional activities, but that's something that could be changed. It is, it's a minor income. We get a couple thousand from the electricity and same from the production. But I can look into that too.
So unless we've drawn it out in a fiscal policy that we're going to treat these funds differently, we need to treat them the same across the board. So can somebody take a look at that
Well, we
in
can do that,
terms
yeah.
of,
So this is
after the budget's done?
Got some notes here, we'll be looking it up.
not new news, is it? We've been doing this for a while.
I mean, it's a really small amount of money, so it could be that.
That's not the point. I think the point is,
Meaning that
is it a special account that we have inside the general fund? That's the question we need to find out.
the 015 is it, if I'm speaking correctly, it's its own bucket of money, but it's
It is.
within the general
Yeah,
fund.
we
Is
have
that a
another way to
correct statement?
classify it, right?
Yeah,
Could I make a comment?
yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, maybe I can just help clarify the question. When we report our financial statements to the outside world, all of the funds that begin with a zero are condensed into what we commonly call the general fund. But within the city's internal operations, we have established each of these that's not 001 as a separate managerial fund, which gives you direct control, more direct control over those dollars than if they melted into the true general fund. So these are within the city regarded as separate funds for managerial purposes.
These are non-departmental, though.
Yes, and for the most part, they don't relate to a specific department. They're just operational things the city undertakes.
For instance, the 011 might be related to fire, but it's not part of their, what I'll call their activities. It's a separate fund then inside the general fund as a replacement.
Yes.
Okay, so we've established that, for instance, for IT, we've got a special fund, correct, for that?
Yes, they're in a different group called
I
Internal
understand,
Service
okay.
Funds.
But I want to make sure we're clear when we're, because I did say before, the general fund, we don't receive monies back to those specific departments, but you're saying non-departmental types of things are done that way.
Yes, because we treat these as separate funds, they are isolated for their particular purpose.
Make sure we're clear on
So the
that.
funds that IT receives for service to the fire district, does that go to the general fund balance, or does it go to the IT managerial account balance?
Well, that's a separate group. Those are called internal service funds, and the money is dedicated just to that fund's purpose. Those are not part of the general fund in any way.
Okay.
Yes, make sure we're clear.
So I think an easy solution is we would just replace the revenue with a general fund appropriation and leave the revenue by itself in the general fund. We could do that. How about the revolving reserves, which are on the next page? God, I'm not going through these very quickly, am I?
We should probably skip ahead to internal services.
Okay. So we do have
Yeah, eventually.
Well, back up.
We have to do
Back
it
up.
before 7
No.
o'clock, right?
We can do it as
I don't mind if we skip it. I want to read it before we skip it, though.
Well, that page deals with the operations that we're using out of the general fund reserves. And we've talked about these at least in one committee. So you guys have got a human services fund now, right? That is, and a human services commission that's a little different than when I was here. So we're funding that out of reserves, or at least initially?
So.
Yes.
Is this the funding of the Human Services Fund, or we had a discususing about increasing this year? Is that the
So the agenda
increase?
bill that was approved was a $50,000 transfer from the revolving reserve fund, just in case there's a recession that could potentially happen, and therefore we didn't maybe have enough money necessarily to devote to human services. Well, we can draw upon that $50,000 to continue to support those programs. In addition to that, council approved a $33,000 increase above the 1% of general fund revenues. Upwards of 1.12% is where council settled at that time. And indeed, we are moving a line item from the non-departmental department inside the general fund that relates to community human services out into this new fund so that we could better track what we're spending, as well as having that reserve available just in case.
And that increase you just mentioned, that latter part, is going to be for 2018 applications
Yes.
that are being reviewed as we speak. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So why don't we skip to the utilities for a second?
Okay, you can go back.
So we've talked about these in committee too. The enterprise funds or the utilities here are self-contained operating funds for which we planned a portion of the capital improvement program to be funded. I think I've said before that roughly the strategic plan, which you guys all approved on, what, September or something this year, has a mix of about 20%, 20 to 30% cash, 70 to 80% borrowing. And I want it, so all we're doing is moving in these adjustments, the share of cash that the utilities are going to put into the construction fund into the bond construction fund. And the major expenditure change in the enterprise funds is moving the CIP projects that did not get started or finished in 2017 into 18. It's a big jump. So it's 18 million bucks that we're putting in 2018. You want to?
That's correct.
Okay.
No, you're
Good, correct.
18.
So that's all we're doing there. The reason I wanted to stop here for a moment is, again, I've got quite a bit of this cyber feedback with people believing that we're out there raising $54 million in bonds, revenue bonds. And we're not. The total cost of existing improvements and new projects is the $54 million. And as I said earlier, about $25 million of that over the 6-year period is scheduled to be paid in cash from utility rates, which you all, I'm not telling you guys anything new, except maybe Mr. Sundwall and Mr. Mayhew. So in my view, the worst case borrowing in the current plan is $45 million. That's already depreciated because one of the largest projects, I think the largest you will do in 18, phase 2 of the sewer reclamation work, came in $3 million below bid. So there's also the, God, I don't know, I can't believe I'm saying this, but
You're going to compliment
between
Marcy.
Mrs. Sanders and Marcinko's, they've brought millions of dollars in TIP money and Public Works revolving trust funds. The plan does not anticipate grabbing any of those funds. And they've been very, very successful in getting millions of dollars from the various agencies. So that's another possibility. But I kind of wanted to erase this notion that we're out raising $54 million tomorrow to pay for these projects.
And to be clear as to the $3 million, so we're all on the same page, working with our engineers of RH2, combining the 6 phases and doing some adjustments and working with them, there was a $2 million plus savings in doing so. And then the contract, the bid opening we had 2 weeks ago now, I believe it was, came in just shy of $1 million. So that's the $3 million Rob's referring to. Just so we're on the same page with that.
Okay.
So that's really all I wanted to say about the utility funds. We can move on. I mean, it's a huge issue to kind of gloss over, but I think it's very well articulated in Drew's report on the CIP, which is on the website. And if you haven't seen it, we'll be glad to send you a copy of it. Okay, so we wanted to skip to the internal services funds, again, which are 4 funds that we have in the city that charge for services to other departments, all other departments, IT, equipment rental, facilities, and,
shared service.
Self-insurance,
So there's-
shared services, which is our general overhead. I guess technically.
There was a risk management fund
Right.
that doesn't have any issues.
No changes to and that's managed by the city clerk for us.
So Jody's the one that's managed her budget.
So I'm going to ask PJ to come up here and help us. Of course, one of the most significant of these 4 funds is information technology. And boy, you guys are on a roll when it comes to software. The next 5 or 6 years, there are proposals to invest in our asset management program, largely for Public Works, to replace the financial information system, about $600,000, and to get the city clerk's records management system up. And we're asking you to consider us letting us hire some temporary help or time-limited help to manage these. And PJ is going to explain that to you, if you don't mind.
This was first discussed by the Finance and Administration Committee last Tuesday night. For those those who were attending that.
Good evening, Council. We're proposing this technology. Biggest change we have here for your 502 fund is the proposal to hire a term-limited technology project manager to basically take on some of the what I would consider fundamental, foundational pieces that the city is attempting to bring into fruition, which is, if you see at our item 3, section 3, I should say, the upcoming enterprise projects we have there, the finance software replacement, electronic records management system, and asset management system. These are foundational pieces of the city's software portfolio that needs to be planned, developed, and implemented correctly. If we don't do that, we could be spending some money in the future. These are essentially, it's like we're building a house, and here we're going to make sure the foundation is right, not just the paint is great and the siding's fantastic. If it's going to fall at the first sign of trouble, we didn't do our jobs right. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if council has any.
So this is something I strongly recommend that the city proceed with. The technology, 5, 6, 7 years ago was basically you took it off the shelf and you installed it and life went on and you went running down the road. Now it is so integrated and so complex behind the scenes that you can end up with not only configuration problems by making poor choices or by not understanding your processes, or just because your network architecture might not handle something and you need specialized code in it. And with the 3 major pieces of software that you're trying to put in, you really need to have somebody that's specialized in implementations that will help staff walk through what their processes is and be able to translate that not only into the configuration but also into the technology behind it. It kind of bridges the technology and the end user. So I was telling PJ that until this year, I didn't buy into this concept until my last project, and they make a huge difference. We actually had a contract position I just hired permanently because the value that they bring is tremendous. So I figured Brian would probably second that. I know you were just coming off of a major software project, and this type of person can really cut the noise out.
And they can make or break a project too.
Yeah, so I mean, the trick is you got to hire right.
Right.
That's correct.
I mean, at the end of the day, you got to have the right person that you hire, but, this is something I would really highly recommend funding.
And in the past, for other organizations, my experience has been that typically it was pushed off to the IT staff to try to help do this, and/or regular city staff whose job it was to take the software and use it. The difficulty there is that those folks already have full-time jobs. IT can certainly support this, but when you got a vendor, you got city staff who obviously need to take on the software and use it, and you got IT staff, sometimes you can get the finger pointing as to who's responsible for what portion of this, and it's really important that, similar to what I'll call, analogous to what I'll call a construction project, we would never allow city staff just to be the owner's rep on those types of things. We need a special project manager to make sure that it's synthesized, and obviously we keep the wheels turning forward. I'll call the tip of the spear type person. I can't expect that to be city staff, and I wouldn't ask our IT staff to do that. They have to make sure that everything works in the back end, but they can't be the project managers.
Right. Operations and projects are two similar but different skill sets.
Mm-hmm. Our goal really is to bridge that gap that we know is we're lacking right now or is missing right now. We're hoping that some of these bigger projects, if you would recall, we just recently implemented our permit software, which is a big lift for our staff, not just for technology staff, but also for our community development staff. What we anticipated as a 9-month project has dragged on for quite some time because you really need to be able to dedicate resources to it. And like Bob Larson said, we need to be able to have that person that spearheads this process and kind of herds everybody, keep them moving forward. Otherwise, we could easily get lost. In the city, we're constantly doing things, churning. If we're not doing this, we're moving on here because we have other projects moving forward. So we want to make sure we keep tabs on that and keep the focus moving forward, make sure we meet our deadlines, we meet those milestones.
So it makes a lot of sense to do this. You've shown us 4 options on what kind of a person are we looking for, whether it's a consultant or an employee with different operations on that. So it looks like that limited term employee is probably a good option. And you've said that there are those kinds of people out there. And I guess I'm wondering if we approve of this and we perceive it to be a 3-year project, it may be 2 or it may be 4. But at the end of the term of this person setting these things up, is the idea that your IT department can then take the handoff and then can then manage it from there on out?
That's the goal. So we really wanted to present this to council with specific deliverables tied to it. Not just asking for a position for the sake of asking a position. Rather, we're saying this position is going to deliver on these 3 specific items. And at the end of the term of this position, we would have delivered this to you. Provided, of course, that the scope remains within the boundaries that we expect it to be. We want to make sure of that. But we also want to make sure we got some leeway in there in the event that the city decides to take on another big project that's outside of these 3 enterprise projects. We would have that asset already ready to deploy in-house. Potentially extending that or just reallocating that resource. But again, in my mind, I want to make sure that I tie this specific position to specific projects because I owe that to council and to obviously the citizens and the staff in here that I want to make sure these are delivered as we have promised.
I think this will give you a flavor for what this type of individual can do for you. There's a rather large segment of the pool that they want short-term, well, I don't consider 3 years short-term, but they would short-term assignments. So the pool is out there that would do something like this. I think what you're going to find is once you see the value in this position, those projects start lining up because even though they're not enterprise wide systems or significant systems, tier 1 systems, however you want to label these 3, you then start thinking about how these systems can play off of each other and share data and, instead of putting the same data into 2 different systems, now you get them talking to each other. So I did the same kind of exercise PJ did to basically justify my hire. We were going to do a similar thing in terms of a contract position, but once we started listing out all of those other potential projects, we realized we had a permanent position. So I don't know if that kind of helps frame it for you. I think having it as a limited term employee makes sense, and then you can go from there.
Yes.
So is the budget amount then going to be around 110,000?
That is the ask right now, yes.
Okay.
I think we were saying about 100 to 110 K. I'm trying, yes.
PJ, I didn't ask earlier, but does that include benefit load?
Yes.
So, just so we're clear then, because we had these discussions, I want to make sure that's enough in there because our concern was having to hire somebody who's got some pretty good IT background, and
sure.
I don't want to come in short, if you will. I don't know if that's going to cover it for a salary and benefits for a full-time employee.
Sure. So we're estimating, so we did some research. Issaquah just recently hired this type of position to essentially just do their finance system, and they paid, I think, fully loaded was $132,000. So at max would probably be at that.
Yeah. Just given it's still, it's more than the 110 you're estimating here, and I just want to make sure that we've got enough in the budget. It's more money, obviously, but I would suggest maybe increasing that, because I'm just concerned. I know what IT folks are costing, and PJ knows better than I do, and with depending on the type of employee you get, you might end up with someone who's really, really good, but it doesn't match the budget we've got available.
It does seem light, but my frame of reference is for-profit, and I know that there's a little bit of a differential, so.
It's a unique skill set.
The thing I see is I don't see how the full-time employee estimated cost matches up with the consultant cost. In other words, we went the consultant route, the type of person that's going to charge $100, $200 an hour, I don't think is going to do the job for what is probably $72,000 a year in salary. Is that what about that is?
That's the 100. If we do the term limited as fully loaded position, including benefits, yeah, it would probably be around that.
Yeah. Don't forget on these type of consultants, not only are you paying the consultant's time, but you're usually paying upwards to 30% for their firm.
To reiterate what Kathy said, actually, I guess it was maybe Bob that said this. I'm somewhat concerned that I don't have a problem with the position. I don't know how many people will take this job as it's been described with the importance of it, would take it for $72,000 a year in East King County.
We can certainly do a bit more research, and I can work with finance, obviously, in ensuring that we are at the right ballpark.
Well, I would suggest for budgeting that maybe we put 150 into the budget, because you still have to come forward with a job description.
Yes.
And a salary level, so you can kind of take that offline and at least get it into the budget.
And you can do these with an ITPM generalist. You have what we call the functional knowledge in your staff. So if you're going for a ITPM specialist, yeah, these salaries start to jump up pretty quick. You can probably do it for that.
Yeah, it just leaves flexibility.
Yeah.
So I have no concerns about the actual need, but the biggest concern I have is in light of us taking on tonight's agenda, looking at doing that in-depth controls and procedures look, I'm concerned that the result of that study and review will be that we're short of some personnel on the administrative side of it, kind of the people on the back end that have stacks of paper that have gone from tripled in size over the last few years, and maybe we've not been attending to those. So I guess I would want Rob or Bob or someone to speak more to what do they see as the revenue sources to help pay for these, given the constraints we've all been looking at trying to meet some of these staffing needs, and can we handle some of those additional needs on top of that?
Oh, God, well, you're catching me short.
Especially when Drew was doing the presentation, the first kickoff was kind of, again, looking at those long-term projections with the expense line kind of being a flat line, as Councilmember Mayhew pointed out. And we were looking at some of the challenges just with the expenses and or how those revenues, based on which projects came in, rectified, the lines crossing to being sustainable. And so if we start messing with the expense line without looking at those two together in conjunction, that's what concerns me. I have no question that we have multitudes of needs that we need to fill.
Well, the typical drill in IT is that we spread the costs to the other departments that benefit from the investment. And so we would propose to do that.
Of course, then we need more revenue for all those departments.
But collectively, that's a zero-sum.
So that's borrowing for Peter to pay Paul.
But it's, the enterprise funds pay some, the utilities pay some.
Oh, okay, so a portion of this.
Right.
I mean, that's a great answer right off the bat. Thank you, Rob. Is to point out that
all three of these would have.
Yeah, probably 40–50% of this would come out of enterprise funds and wouldn't be putting pressure on the general fund, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, and I think also these three.
In other words, this IT
Yeah.
Councilmember Holloway's frowning, the IT is serving all the enterprise funds back in services, or this employee would be. So a good chunk of their compensation would come out of charging the enterprise fund departments.
We colloquially call that monopoly money. It's not real revenue to the city. It just means that those other departments have a revenue expense issue.
I understand that. I'm just saying it's pushing it to a different revenue expense projection. The one I was particularly concerned about was the challenges in the general fund.
It's not, the 110 is not totally supported by the general fund, I think is what you're trying to say.
Right.
We're diversifying the burden.
Yeah. And I would also point out the 3 projects that they will be working on. You can either do these 3 projects, or you will have to hire resources in terms of FTE, because these 3 systems should be making you more productive and allowing each staff member to do their work more efficiently.
That's the expectation, yes. Especially with, finance software, electronic records, and definitely the asset management. We're in dire need of getting that system up. We tried to launch it this past year and just ran into all sorts of issues with trying to get staff to help, and they just don't have the time and the capacity to do it, so. These are critical. The other piece that we consider, and I want to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn, because I haven't spoken in detail with Rob or anybody from finance about this, but the council obviously is well aware that we've got some reserves. This is a limited term position. Expending it for some of the reserves for 2 or 3 years, I think it's money well spent. Especially when you're looking at these are considered to be what I'll call capital projects. These are, obviously they play into the operation side, so that it's a one-time expense on the software piece. It's also a one-time expense, if you will, on getting these things launched as well.
Well said. Why don't I stop there? See if you got anything. I want to reemphasize that the budget that is coming to you, amended or not, is balanced. The city is not deficit spending and has not ever deficit spent since at least I've been associated with it. So we're doing okay. We have some really good resources. The real estate excise tax fund has been a big boon because of increase in property values. And we're okay. We have the money to make these changes, and we're solvent.
So I have a layman's question. I'm not a budget guy. I hate it. Gives me a headache. But if I was just some guy watching this on the live stream for all like 13 people that are watching this right now, if I was one of those people and not with a CPA background or finance background, I would look at what I was just shown and counter that with what you just said, and they wouldn't match. Because with very, very few exceptions, we were over in every single budget item. We're asking for more in every single budget item, with the exception of Mr. Marcinko. Good job, Marcinko. So how do I rectify the optics of it looking like, and maybe it's just how it's presented, but remember, this is a public meeting, and we have regular people like me that don't understand all the accounting stuff. When I walk out of this today, and let's say my wife was watching this, like, Sean, that doesn't look like a balanced budget to me. How would I explain that to her?
Well, we're not showing. I guess we really didn't show totals. I suppose we can do that. But the point is that, and the changes we made are amendments that the council approved during the year. They're all jumbled up at the end because we do that to avoid having a public hearing to pass every ordinance that amends it. So most of them are conscious decisions that this council administration has made during the year, like the 2 new police officers and like the 2 new police cars.
Rob, does the resolution that's going to be presented to council tonight, that'll show the balanced budget, correct?
Yeah, we have to have a balanced budget. That's
in fact with an ending fund balance surplus.
Right, but Rob, what you've mentioned at least twice in this meeting today that you've heard, I think you called it cyber chatter, which is a reasonable term. That cyber chatter comes from regular people that live here. And I think in those two instances, it was reasonable for that chatter to exist because the way things are presented is not easily consumable. And part of, I believe, part of transparency in government is not just having cameras in chambers, as Jim has said many times in his short tenure here. It's how we present information to the people who are paying for us to be here. And I think we have a ways to go in that.
Well, I won't argue with you. I did say that we will say that we tried to be as transparent as we could here. We've admitted our mistakes in several categories here where we needed to bump the budget up to fix that. It's not an especially easy process to understand, particularly in government fund accounting. But nonetheless, the city is not deficit spending. It is not in the hole. And I don't mind people watching or criticizing or asking questions. What I do mind is people jumping to conclusions that are so far off the information that's provided them that it's, you know, it skews the emotions.
Wait. So the internet's a wonderful thing, and it just hates a vacuum. So if you don't fill it, it's going to fill it.
Yeah.
Case in point tonight, for police, we said it was 287,000 additional expenditure. That was the statement. In actual fact, again, it was an increase in expenditures only. There was no discussion of decrease in expenditures, nor any change in revenue. Case in fact, on that one, there's probably a decrease in expenditure of the police officers we are currently short, and they will probably come in under budget by about 200,000.
And that's why we're not changing those line items.
Well, it's half a story, and again, the internet loves a vacuum because it'll throw all kinds of stuff in there.
I think, what I think the council members are trying to say is we're doing ourselves a disservice because all we look at is where we need to increase. We don't look at, you know, throughout the year, we approve many agenda bills that are actually coming in under the budgeted cost of it, but we don't make those adjustments as we go through this process. And I would agree with the council members that we're telling half the story. We're only going through the exercise because we need to make sure we have those line items at an appropriate level so that we can expend those funds. But we're really trying not to get into a true budgeted position where you are making those other adjustments back down. And I think for the average citizen who doesn't work in government, that work for usually for-profits, that's totally an arcane way of looking at it for most people. They're looking at it through the lens of, you know, all I see is the budget going up. They don't see that we haven't made the budget items come down for those. And somehow I think the city has to tell that story because, you know, our staff does an enormous job in terms of managing those costs on a project-by-project basis. But this exercise doesn't show that.
And it's also, I'm going to take an attempt at this. Council may recall those who are, well, there's only 3 of you here who have been here prior to 2017, but you may recall that we've always budgeted to the general fund to have an ending fund balance. And folks who hear that say that doesn't exist in the private sector. You don't get to turn money over to the following year and start your funds, if you will, your revenues with that ending fund balance. But the council's policy for finance, obviously, I said we would continue to practice that. Because you can't end up in the hole, otherwise you're going to have to make amendments at the end of the year. And that's why we keep those expenditure appropriations the way we do, so that we don't drift into that, what I'll call the gray area at the end of the year, where council's establishing or approving the budget for the next year or for the current year and the amended almost a month prior to the end of the year. And so we were 1/12 of the, you know, we got 1/12 of the year left to expend on.
So if I could just say,
So-
I think you're right, but to an extent. But so first off, companies do roll things over. It's called retained earnings.
Yeah.
So if they come up short or if they end up over, that does roll into something that's a fund balance by a different name. And many companies do lose money, and that takes away from their fund balance or retained earnings. So but let's not get caught up in that, because I think you agree with our main point, which is we're not telling the story well. We could tell the story better, and I think that's all we're trying to encourage you to do.
I agree 100%.
So we're not asking necessarily for council to approve the ordinance tonight. This is for kind of a second reading for the most part. We will be asking council to adopt this at the first meeting in December. We can then start having those discussions on fund health, which is something that we did start back at the council workshop as well, and start bringing those conversations back. We apologize for not presenting that information today because we wanted to simplify this so that we could all support the understanding around here about what is changing in terms of expenditures. That is the story that we wanted to tell today, and hopefully we've done that through this presentation so far. So I want to keep that in mind, and if council wants, we could certainly come back at the next meeting, maybe another council workshop to then discuss the health of each and every fund.
And I've put notes here for the council's retreat. It's in the end of January. That'd be an ideal time to talk about how we present this information and how we discuss it. And if I could just ask for, we've got this proposal for the technology project manager. Is there any issues with any council members we should be aware of now before we place this? Mayor's going to put it into his request for 2018.
Well, again, my concerns were assuaged. As most of the council knows, there's an engineering position that we hired that was sort of a time-limited, full-time position. And so that I was assuaged with concerns about the commitment here if we put a time limit of 2 or 3 years on this position so that it can be reevaluated in terms of long-term projections.
Suggest that.
I think that might provide more comfort level for everyone in that regard.
Well, and you may look at specific hiring by project versus position.
Well, we know there's a bunch of projects that are going to be in a pipeline for at least a couple of years. It'll be pretty backed up. But once we're through those, we can evaluate whether that position is needed any longer.
Just so we're clear, we've got 3 that have been identified in this proposal, and those are the 3 we're looking at for this term-limited position. These 3 and these 3 only.
Please, I'm just, as we had in discussions recently, I'm worried about a contract employee versus contract for services, which have different implications.
This is not a contract.
So this would be an actual employee that is hired for a period of time.
Right.
So this would actually be an employee of the city of Snoqualmie. They just go into it with the recognition that the position ends.
All right, thank you.
Well, thanks for your attention. I know it's long and dull, and I guess I got to get some new jokes. Anyway, we're done.
Your Councilmember Holloway, as you recall, Jeff's position was that connected to a lot of the main enterprise fund projects. That was a time-limited position as a city engineer. So I would see it similar to that. We have a fusion of a number of projects. We bring an FTE in to address those and then evaluate it at the end of that.
Mayor, if I could, we actually have 2 of those engineer positions.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
That's 2.
All right.
They did as well.
Is council going to complain? If any other questions at this point, I was hoping at least to get a 5-minute break, but we still have a couple more minutes if you want to ask any other clarifying questions or discussion. I will say before we break, however, I wanted to quickly introduce Ann McLaughlin. Ann, are you back there? Could you stand up, please? So Ann is on the agenda tonight. One of the first things we're going to do at the beginning of the, as soon as possible, is to gear up. Ann is one of the most renowned parliamentarians in the state that does training on how to run a good, efficient meeting. I know that she's going to score me very badly on how this very informal workshop just occurred. We're going to tighten it up at the beginning of the council meeting. I want to ask for at least 2 things that we're going to try and clean up right off the bat, which is you don't speak unless being recognized by the chair. And then we do a bit of a round robin where you keep yourself from dominating the conversation, allow all the council members an opportunity to speak before it comes back to you again.
So how do you want us to indicate that we have something to say so that you can recognize us?
My job is to look down the line and be looking for anyone to say Mr. Chair or just getting my attention. If I'm not paying attention, it's incumbent upon all the members to say, point of order, Mr. Chair. So-and-so speaking without being recognized or whatever. So it's incumbent upon all the members to make sure that we're following the protocol.
Is that just for this week while she's here, or?
No, sir. We're gonna kind of tighten the ship up a little bit.
I'm pretty sure
We'll see. She'll be back in January.
You'll be getting the full-blown training. She's just here as a spy tonight. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break.
So move, second.